Hi everyone, welcome to the latest video on the channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this Jaime Lannister model for the Song of Ice and Fire Miniatures game. This is a Kickstarter exclusive model, so it's not easy to get if you haven't already got one. But it's a nice break from the normal red, gold and silver that you normally see on the Lannister models. I really did enjoy painting this model. I've tried to kind of keep it the same kind of colour tones that you would normally see in a Stark Army. So if you like the way it looks, please consider liking and subscribing. And let's get straight into the video. So as normal with all my character models, what I try to do is start off with painting the eyes. Now, this isn't always something that everyone wants to do when they're painting the models, but I feel like the face on this one actually kind of works really well if you want to do the eyes on him. So I come in with my most fine detail brush and I'm painting it with white. What I try to do is paint two pupils on either side of what looks like the sculpted area of the eye. You don't have to be very precise about this. All you're trying to emulate at this point in time is having a nice black line in between those two dots that you initially make. Now it will be messy, so this is why we do it first, and you can see what I'm doing now is coming in with a black paint just to kind of neaten it up, try to kind of keep that white in the eye area, and that's the eyes done. So once the eyes are done, we can come in with the flesh shade, the first flesh shade. So the reason why I do the eyes first is obviously because if I was painting the flesh first and kind of painted it all the way to the end, you know, with highlighting, shading and all of that stuff, what it would likely cause is me being messy. So what I mean by that is if you paint the skin tone and then paint the eyes in after, you're likely going to get white on the skin and things like that. So painting the eyes first, if you do want to do the eyes, is a lot easier in my eyes than doing it after. So you can see all the colours behind me right now, and I'm working my way through them very slowly. As you can see, there's not much flesh to do on this model, so although there are quite a lot of colours, it doesn't really take that long to do. If you've watched any of my other videos, you may also have heard me say before that I believe painting the skin tone to a higher level than you normally would is quite rewarding. Now I wouldn't normally do this on all of my rank and file models, it just would take too long, and obviously that's all wholly dependent on whether you actually want to take your model to a next level or things like that. But on character models I normally paint the skin tone to a higher shade than what I normally would. So you can see what I'm doing here at this stage is just kind of getting down this base colour on all the skin areas, and you can see that I'm being very careful around the eyes and things like that. Now I do believe that when I was painting this I actually kind of got a bit in the pupils. Now this isn't a problem, so it's easy to kind of fix and things like that because obviously we've only done a base colour. So if you do get a bit on the eyes, don't worry about it. We can, yeah, it's a relatively easy fix. So that's why I believe that doing the eyes first is a lot easier. So once we do the base colour, you can see me now coming in with the second colour, and what I'm doing at this point in time is kind of blocking in more or less the kind of areas that I'm going to be highlighting up at a later stage. So you don't have to be very specific about this, but the general rule of thumb at this point in time is kind of getting in the kind of highlights where the main highlights are going to be at a later point in time. Now for the hands, it's obviously going to be the back of the hand, and obviously trying to start to single out each individual finger, as you can see that I'm doing there. I'm also leaving some of that undercolour to start off with. Now that's obviously to start creating the nice smooth blends from shading to highlighting, but you don't want to go too crazy with this because what it will do is it will create a too stark of a highlight too quickly, which means that the blends won't be smooth. On the face, I'm focusing on the nose, the cheeks, the forehead and the lips. So those are the areas that you want to be focusing on just to highlight. Obviously you still want to be careful of the eyes when you're doing that, so just be careful, take your time and try to be as neat as possible. After the second colour, we come in with the third colour or the second highlight, and again we're doing the exact same process, but we're just refining this now, going in and painting less and less, just so that you can kind of start to see the smooth transition of the colour on the hands. Now obviously we're going to be doing this on the face as well, but what I'm trying to show you here is obviously I'm painting less and less every single time. Obviously painting less and less every single time creates a smooth transition of colour, and obviously highlights the skin, makes it look more realistic. You can also see where on the forehead as well I'm starting to paint lines just to kind of simulate that there's wrinkles, not wrinkles, but you know, when you actually look at someone's forehead, they do kind of have natural lines on their face. So I'm trying to create that, or start to kind of show that there are lines on the face. Notice how much paint that I have on my brush when I'm doing this. Obviously, it's very important once you're painting very light colours, just to take your time with it and just be as neat as possible. So using a smaller brush just gives you a lot more control than what you would normally have. Now once that paint's dry, what I come in with now is the Reichland Flesh Shade from Games Workshop. Now I'm doing this to kind of blend in all the colours that we've initially done. Now this obviously ties all of them colours in really nicely and kind of adds a level of warmth to the skin tone. Now you could miss this out if you want to. It's not a necessary stage, but it's just the kind of process or recipe that I've kind of been using for all of my models. So it kind of keeps them all kind of tied in as well. And also I kind of got a bit heavier with this than what I normally would on a skin tone, and that's kind of because I'm trying to represent that Jaime at this point in time is kind of messy, you know, he's not really clean, so having a kind of darker skin tone than what he would normally have, you know, kind of works really well. So once that colour's properly dry, and as with any wash, I believe it should always be dry. There are some certain instances where it doesn't need to be 100% dry before you start doing a highlight, but this is important to have dry before you start coming on to this next highlight. And it's again the same process as we were doing with the first highlight colours, but now you can kind of see how this kind of colour pops. You know, all the details kind of showing up now. Again, I'm being very careful with the brush. I'm using my most fine detail brush, and again taking my time with it, kind of picking out those very specific details that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, obviously you can see here again I'm focusing on the nose. I'm now painting in nostrils as well. You don't have to do this on your model, but I think the sculpt on this actually is kind of showing that the nostrils are actually big enough for you to actually paint if you want them to be painted. So do them if you want to. And again, I'm focusing on the cheeks, or the raised edges of the cheeks, the lips, and the forehead again. There are some wrinkles obviously that I've kind of started to put in myself, so I'm kind of following those lines that I did earlier. Now that's the reason why we do multiple colours, because what it does is it allows you to create a smoother blend by painting on top of the colours that you've initially put down before. If you only done, let's say, 3 colours on a skin tone, you wouldn't be able to put all of these details in and make it look like a smooth blend, because the colours, the step up from the darker colour to the lighter colour is so harsh in comparison that it just won't look as smooth. So this is why I paint with more colours than what you would normally see typically on a tabletop miniature. Now, although I say this level of skin tone is relatively higher, you can go way more complex with it. You can paint the lip a different color. You can go brighter with the highlights. You can add, you know, spots on them. There's loads of different things you can do. But for a typical skin tone, you know, this is a relatively, not complex, but a relatively time-consuming way of painting the skin tone. Now this is only one model, and it took me about 10 minutes to do the skin tone. So if you was painting a unit of 12 guys, it would take you 2 hours just to do the skin tone. So, you know, if you wanted to do that, you know, just this is kind of the time frame it may take you just to do the skin tone on those models, if you was going up to this kind of level. So with all of the other colours done, we're moving on to the final highlight now. That, as I say in all of my other videos, this is generally almost a white colour, so you have to be very careful when you're using this kind of colour. So only focus on the most extreme edges. Now generally when you're doing a skin tone, those areas are the knuckles, the tips of the nose, and the cheeks if you want to, but generally that's all you need to do. So be very reserved when you're doing this kind of colour, because if you go over the top with it, it will just make the skin tone kind of look ghostly. And like I said before, I want him to look kind of a bit dirty, so don't go too over the top with this. Obviously you can do it however you like, but a general rule of thumb is just to focus on those most extreme edges, and after that's done, that's the skin done. So after the skin tone's done, what I'd do now at this point in time is just go around with a black edge. Now you don't have to do this on your model if you're still painting it, but for the reason of me, doing this tutorial for you. I want to kind of show exactly what parts I've been painting and what parts haven't been painted yet. So I just quickly go around the face, the beard, and things like that, just where I've kind of overspilled with skin tone, just to show you that, the areas that I've painted of this model, just to show you how the skin tone looks and things like that. Now, like I say, you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but black lining is a skill that I think most people should learn if they can. So if you want to, you can kind of follow the steps that I do over the whole model, including this black lining. Now, one tip for this is obviously take your time, because obviously we've just spent 10 minutes doing the skin tone. So take your time when you're doing this. Use a very, very detailed brush and see how slowly that I'm going around these areas. So try to be as neat as possible, try to be as slow as possible. And if you need to be a bit more sturdy with your hand, what you can kind of do is press your arms against the table that or the work surface that you're using, and then press your hands together as well, just to give you a bit more control. Now in this video I'm using a painting handle, or a model handle. There's loads of different names for these. Now I was suggested to use one of these by one of the people that follow my tutorials. Hello, if you're watching this video. Now I do think that these are very good tools. Now for a painting tutorial, it sometimes can be a bit more awkward. Not always, but it can be a bit more awkward. So if you're doing a one-off model like a character, I would suggest investing in one of these. They are very good, but for if you're doing a unit and things like that, I do think sometimes they can be a bit more complicated than they need to be. You can kind of see me kind of holding it awkwardly in some parts, but it's not. I'd say it's more of a advantage to have one of these than to not have one. So besides that, what I'm doing now is I'm starting to put in the base colours for all of the kind of cloth and things like that on this model. Now, what I would normally do on my tutorials, a lot of you may have watched the tutorials that I've done beforehand. What I normally do is I paint an area and then I highlight it to the maximum level. So like I've just done on the skin there, that's what I would normally do with my cloth. Now for this model, because I want it to look dirty, what I'm doing is painting in all the base colours for the cloth. Now you can see all the different colours that I've got behind me. Now what I'm trying to emulate with this Jaime model is the point in the movie where, the point in the series where he's just had his hand cut off, and they're taking him back to his father, and they're trying to keep him undercover, so he's not wearing any insanely rich garments and things like that. He's meant to be looking poor. He's got a beard now, so I'm trying to use earthy tones like green, like brown, and also the fact that the Starks obviously sent him in exchange, or what they thought was in exchange for Sansa and Arya. So I also wanted him to have a blue cloak as well, just to kind of have the kind of same Stark colours. Now, the colour that I'm using is the same as some of the Starks that we have at home that are painted already. I haven't painted any of them, but it's the same colour. So if you have any Starks and you have this Jaime model as well, what I would suggest is painting his cloak the same colour as the Stark army that you have, because this model actually goes into your opposing army's unit, so it would look really nice when it goes into them units. So once the green's done, I'll move on to a different colour again. All earthy tones. You can do this however you like if you want to. I wouldn't do any colour that's insanely bright. So obviously it's all personal preference. And again, you can use these colours that I'm using and paint it the same way as I have, or kind of mix and match them however you like. Now I've just kind of painted this however I thought would look right. I kind of just chose the paint straight out of the box. Kind of looked at them as a group and thought, yeah, they look relatively good together. None of them kind of overpowers the other. So take that in mind when you're doing something like this. But besides that, go crazy with what you want to do with it. So what you can see though is I'm using a bigger brush now. Now I'm using a bigger brush just to make it a lot easier to quickly put on this base coat. But notice how I've still got a nice tip on the brush, just to give me more control. Now I don't want to be slapping on this paint really thick or anything like that. But also I don't normally do 2 layers when I'm doing a base coat, especially if I'm doing a wash after. So what I suggest when you're doing something like that is get a nice brush, relatively decent sized brush, but something that you can control, just to make it a lot quicker for you to do a step like this. Just notice how I'm constantly as well turning the model just to kind of get in all those nooks and crannies that you might normally miss if you didn't turn the model. This pose is really nice, but some areas on it are a bit awkward to get to, so just take your time with doing all the base coats just to make it a lot easier for you. So again, once that colour's dry or relatively dry, we can come in with the next colour. Now, what I normally say when painting or for new painters and things like that, you don't want to start painting a new colour until all the other colours around it are dry. Now, if you're experienced, you can kind of work your way around this just by the fact that you can be a bit neater when you're painting, but it isn't always the case for you to have to let the paint dry before moving on to the next colour. Now you can see what I'm doing right now is obviously a completely new colour. It's completely different to all the other colours that I've already painted so far, and it's near some of the clothing that's that I've already been painted and base coat, and that colour's not dry. Now, if you weren't careful, what could happen is those two colours could spill into each other, and it will just cause a mess and make more problems than than if you just waited normally. So it's important to let the paint that you've done beforehand dry to a relatively simple level of dryness before moving on, and you can normally get away with it. But if you aren't confident, just take your time with it. Wait for it to properly dry before moving on to the next stage. Especially if you're a new painter as well, taking your time is the most important thing. Now, as I mentioned before, obviously when I was picking these colours out, I tried to create the same blue that's on the Stark Army that we have at home here that I haven't painted. Now this is that colour. You can see the coverage is a bit rubbish over this black, so what I actually do is go over it twice. Now it doesn't. You can see obviously it doesn't really take that long to do it this first coat. So the second coat literally took me about 30 seconds, not even that probably. Especially because I don't have to be as neat the second time round. But when you're doing a second colour over a second layer of a base coat, you should 100% wait for it to properly dry beforehand, because what will happen is the first surface won't be properly dry and it will kind of scratch the paint. So if you're a bit lazy and don't bother waiting for that extra 5 minutes, it'll actually cause way more problems. It will completely mess up the figure, and it'll kind of it won't be a nice smooth surface. So just take your time with it, wait for it to properly dry. Now this did take me a bit longer to dry than 5 minutes. I think it maybe took 10 minutes or so. So just put it down for a minute and paint something else, or just wait and do something else. But yeah, it's better to be patient and wait for it to properly dry before doing a second coat. So whilst this cloak is still drying, number one, I have to be careful of not touching it, and number two, obviously be careful of not getting this new colour on any of the parts that have already been painted. Now this top part of his cloak, generally what you see is fur, but this part's 100% leather, so I just use this really good leather colour from Wargames Foundry. It's a solid colour, I've been using it for years, and when it's washed with like a dark brown, the kind of colours that you can get from highlighting it up after work really, really nice. So I'm just doing this on this area here. Again, I'm being careful. I've let it dry relatively well, but you can kind of see how shiny it is still, just from the kind of, it's not completely wet, but it's still damp. If I touch that, it would kind of leave my fingerprint on it. So that's the kind of consistency you've got to be careful of, because sometimes you can think, oh, some areas are dry, oh, the whole thing's dry. But actually, there's still parts that are wet, especially in the kind of nooks and crannies, in the creases and things like that. That will definitely still be too wet for you to kind of do a second coat over if you wanted to. Now, you can kind of see where I'm kind of going to the edges of this leather here. Again, I'm being careful. If the paint was too wet at this point in time and I touched it, what would happen is that this brown that I'm using would kind of overspill and kind of mix into that wet blue paint that I've just done on the cloak. So that's what I was talking about earlier, with just waiting long enough for it to be dry so that it doesn't mix, but also not taking you you know, you're not taking ages just waiting for paint to dry before you can move on to the next stage. So it's kind of like a balance in between, you know, patience and speed. So just take your time with it again, and kind of look at the consistency that I'm painting at, so you can kind of see what kind of stage is acceptable to kind of start painting at. So now we're moving on to the other base colours. Again, I didn't want to start putting all of the colours in the background, because it kind of just clutters up the tutorial. So I kind of try to keep it as low as possible. If I'm doing like a recipe for one certain colour, I'll try to put all of them colours in the background. But if I'm doing a base coat, I won't try to clutter it too much in the background, because it's just too busy and sometimes can be quite distracting. So what I'm doing now is using the same brown that I use for all of my leather, or I would say 95% of all the leather belts and straps on my models for this game. I've painted this peaty brown A colour. Now, again, it's the base colour, so be careful with it. Obviously, you don't have to be completely tidy with it. It doesn't matter if you get a bit of overspill onto this green tunic or whatever, because we're going to be highlighting up, we're going to be washing, all these kind of things. So don't be too worried if you do get a bit of overspill. If you do worry about getting overspill on the green or any other colour, you can just come in with that first base colour again and just neaten it up. Again, just wait for the colour to properly dry before you do this, because it can scratch the surface and make more problems than you initially had in the first place if you made a mistake. So yeah, that's a nice and quick stage. Move on to the next stage. Now, because this Jaime model is representing him when he lost his hand, well, it's when Vargo cut his hand off. He obviously has a bandage on his hand now. He's only got one, you know, he's only got his left hand. So I'm using this kind of raw linen colour, and I decided to use it on the kind of wrappings on his legs as well. You can use any colour for this. You can use a different colour if you like. But the reason why I chose this colour on the legs as well as the bandage around his arm is the fact that I didn't want the colour, I didn't want him to look like I'm painting a rainbow. You know, although I'm trying to keep the colour palette kind of neutral, earthy tones, I've actually kind of got, 5 colours on this model at the moment. So you don't want to make it too busy. And also, if you start using loads and loads of different colours, what it does is it just takes even more time for you to paint. So you can sometimes reuse a colour on a model just to kind of bring certain aspects of it to, you know, to kind of complement other parts. So the top part of this model with his bandage has this leather colour. Then the bottom part of the model has the same part. So it kind of, you know, ties in a model, just kind of like an artistic kind of feel. You know, it's nothing over the top. I'm not saying it's kind of like a, you know, an insane, you know, thing to do, but it just, one, it saves me time, and two, it kind of blends the model together. That's the pure reason why I did it. So again, you've got to be careful of doing this. I did also paint the fur on the top, that kind of deep brown leather that I did with the leather at the top as well. But what I decided to do is, although I painted that the same base colour, I'm actually going to highlight it up slightly different to the leather. So although the colours that I'm using are the same, it will actually kind of look slightly different with the kind of texture and stuff like that. So you can also do that as well. You know, use the same colour and highlight it up a different way to get different aspects looking different. With this bandage though, you've got to kind of be careful around the top parts, because obviously we painted the face, and if you're not careful enough, you could get some on. So just be careful. Again, take your time. It doesn't matter if you get any of this colour onto the colours that we've base coated, because we can just go over that again and tidy it up. But it's more important to be careful around the skin and the face. So be mindful of that when you're doing this. Again, I'm using a relatively big brush here, but if you need to, drop down a size. It's better to drop down a size brush and have more control than try to do it too quick and make more problems. Again, patience is the main thing about when you're painting a model. You know, patience allows you to kind of take your painting to the next level. You can kind of see where I'm kind of turning this model just to kind of get in all of the different recesses and things like that. This is where the painting handle comes. Sometimes get a bit awkward, a bit clunky, but it's not really a problem. It's just one of the disadvantages that I've found personally when I'm painting something like this, where it's got all of these different creases and things like that. You've just got to be careful of how you hold the model and things like that. So the final base colour now, is the chain that he's got wrapped around his arm. Now, again, it's the same thing as what I was saying before. Be careful when you're doing this. It's quite easy for you to see exactly what parts need to be this chain colour. And actually, what I did make a mistake of actually not doing the chain all the way down. It kind of goes over his tunic to the front, past his left hand. So if you're doing this, don't forget that. Maybe the kind of sculpt of it was a little bit less detailed than maybe yours is, or I'm not sure, but I personally missed it. So I did see it later on, but just kind of take a note of that when you're doing yours, just to make sure you don't forget that certain part. You can see how I'm kind of being really careful now as well, next to the skin and things like that. And I'm trying to kind of leave that black line. Now, obviously, that's the reason why I did that black line in earlier on, because what it does is it kind of distinguishes those two separate surfaces. So, black is a natural shade, or the deepest shade that anything can have. So it makes sense that there's a black gap between the metal on his, on his chain there and the skin on his hand. Again, I'm picking out a few details here and there. I didn't want to put any gold on him, although he does have a belt buckle. You could do a bit of gold there, just to add a little bit of spot of colour, but I didn't think putting gold on him was a good idea, because obviously he's trying to be undercover more or less. So kept the buckle silver, and that's the silver done. So now that we've done all the base coating on the whole model, what we come in with now is an Agrax Earthshade wash from Games Workshop. Now this is like liquid gold. This is an amazing colour. It can bring loads and loads of different aspects of the model together, even if they're separate colours, and it's perfect for what I'm trying to emulate on this model. So I kind of come in with a relatively heavy coat of it, but what I'm doing is making sure that I'm not getting insane pooling anywhere, because although I want him to look dirty, which is why I've chosen this colour specifically, I don't want him to look like he's been rolling around in mud all day. He's dirty, but he's not, he's not a pig. He's not been rolling around in mud. So be careful with how much you're putting on in certain areas, but be very liberal with it, because you want to get on a nice even coat. You want to work this colour relatively quickly, so you're not getting any scratches or certain parts drying before others, and then it all kind of messing up the texture of the model. So notice how I'm focusing on the main body of him first, so the tunic, the legs and things like that, and the bandages. Now the reason for that is what I did is I kind of done a little test stroke on the cloak to see how this kind of colour works with that grey, the blue grey of the cloak. Now it works okay, but I decided at that point in time that I want the Agrax Earthshade to be on the cloak, but I don't want it to be too heavy. So I'll do the main model with him first, obviously making sure I don't get any on the skin, the hand and things like that. All the way around the leather and things like that. You can kind of see me focusing on those parts first, and then what I do is I decide exactly what I want to do with the cloak. Now it's very important that I did this, because what it does, it allows me to have a lot more working time on this cloak, so that I'm happy with how it looks. So I put on that initial colour on the cloak, and it looks just too dirty for me. So I kind of put a bit of water on my brush just to kind of wet it out a bit more, kind of dilute that colour, and kind of drag this kind of concentrated brown colour from the recesses, so that I don't get, although I've got Agrax Earthshade on it to show that this is a dirty cloak, I'm not making the cloak look brown. This is very, very important for what I'm trying to show on this model. So you can kind of see that I kind of put an initial bit of wash on, I kind of put water on my brush, and then moved it around so that although the darkest recesses kind of look dirty, they're not brown. They are brown, but they're not, it doesn't make the cloak look like it's brown in those parts. It just looks dirty. And that's a very, very quick way of making that look nice and dirty. So what I'm doing now is making sure that the model is completely dry, and then going through each step of the model and painting it to its maximum level. So I start off with the tunic, the green that I started off with, and I'm using the base colour first. Now this is important. When you do a wash, it's a good technique to use the initial base colour first, just to do the first, what you would normally call a highlight, just so that the colour is a smooth transition whilst leaving that brown in the recesses. Now when you use more colours to do a highlight, what it does is it makes any transition that you would normally do smoother. The more colours you use, as long as the colour's not thick, the paint's not thick when you're putting it on, as long as you've got a lot of colours and the colour's not thick when you're painting it on, the transition will always be smoother than if you use less colours on the same transition. That's just how highlighting works, that's how paints work. So using the same base colour is just a nice way to make the colour transition smooth and keep it not looking like I'm painting a cartoon. So I'm being quite liberal with this, but again, I'm leaving those darkest parts where the Agrex Earth shaders settled, so that it creates the natural shading and highlighting. It's quite easy to follow, but again, use a detail brush if you need to, just to make it easier for you to kind of paint these highlighted parts. So once that's dry, we move on to the actual first new colour. Again, I keep all of the colours of the highlighting that I'm going to be doing on a specific part in the background, so you can see that I'm only using 2 actual new highlights. So it doesn't take too long, but it works really nice because the colours kind of blend in together really, really nicely. And although the Phlegm Green Sea, the final highlight, is actually a very, very bright colour, because all of the other colours beforehand mix really well, it actually is a very, very nice highlight. So be nice and careful with this. Obviously choose the parts that you want to be highlighting. Again, I find it pretty easy on this model because the detailing on the clothing, the tunic and the cloak specifically are very, very nice. So there's like nice lines for you to follow, creases, there's good areas of shading where the wash settles, so it's nice and easy for you to see. But if you do struggle with it, kind of just notice how and where I put the highlights on my model. Now, again, this isn't a masterclass tutorial of how to paint this model, but it's a good way to kind of have a relative idea of exactly where you want to be placing these highlights. So as mentioned before, when you do a new highlight, make sure the colour beforehand is properly dry, and we move on to the next stage. Again, this is the Phlegm Green colour. Like I said, it's very, very bright, so I'm being very careful with this. Quite reserved with it. Just doing it on the most prominent edges. Again, those areas that kind of stick out the most. Those creases, those folds in the cloth and things like that that fold into the kind of as I pick the model up, that's the first thing I see when I look at that area of that cloth. So that part should be highlighted to a higher level than other parts maybe should be. That's my kind of my thought process when I'm looking to create a highlight and a shade. And that's that green done. And it didn't really take that long, so we've completed that now. We move on to the next stage, which is now the trousers. Again, I start off with that first base colour just to get that initial colour down. Now, as I mentioned before, I do really like the sculpting on the cloak and the tunic, but the legs, there's something about them that I don't really like that much. They're okay, but maybe it was the colour that I chose. Maybe just didn't work perfectly for it, but you can kind of see the kind of thought process that I'm going through when I'm creating these first redefining the color with the base coat. So I'm not going crazy with like the highlighting or what you would normally do when you're highlighting. I'm just kind of redefining this color. It's easier on the left leg, the one that I'm painting now, but when I move on to his right leg now, you can kind of see that I follow the folds around, and although I'm leaving some of that darker colour in the recesses, you've got to be careful, because if you went too over the top with it, it would just create a kind of cartoon, overly highlighted in some areas and really shady in other areas, and it just wouldn't look right. So being liberal with this first colour, just to redefine it and leaving some shading in the background, is more important than trying to make this seem like it's a first highlight. So just look how I'm kind of the kind of thing that I'm doing, and what I'm trying to actually do, because this is kind of flat, is kind of create a texture that isn't on the surface. Now what I kind of do to do that with my brush is kind of do like a kind of stippling whilst I'm brushing normally. Now it's very subtle, but actually I don't even know if it actually shows up on the video that well, but once I get to the final highlight, you can kind of see how this kind of stippling highlighting works really well to create a texture that isn't normally on the surface. So that's the first beige colour done. Again, wait for that to properly dry before moving on to the next stage. And this is where I kind of start to create these really nice highlights, just by that kind of stippling motion. Again, you have to be careful when you're doing this, because obviously it will kind of look really weird if you're going too harsh with it. So just kind of notice how I kind of do this technique. Now you don't have to kind of copy this technique, but it's something to kind of try if you're trying to create some kind of little texture on a model. Now there's loads of different ways to add textures on models. It's not something that I normally do, but I thought it kind of works well for the leg on this model specifically, because there wasn't really much else I could kind of do with it. So yeah, just notice how I do this, kind of see that kind of quick dabbing of the paint. Again, I'm kind of following the lines that I initially put on, but and this isn't a pure stippling technique, because stippling is kind of just doing loads and loads of dots over a period of time, just to kind of create that natural highlight. And just from the fact that when you create stippling more in one area, it creates a more brighter highlight. So it's kind of the same technique. It's not the same. It's not 100% the same, but it's a kind of derivative of that. So yeah, you can kind of see me doing it there. Again, turning the model just to try and make sure that I get those highlights all the way around, so that nothing kind of looks too out of place. And yeah, and also making sure that I leave some of that darker shading in the recesses. You can also notice I'm still using that larger brush. Like I said before, I use generally I use one large brush, one small brush, and that's what I use for all models now. For cavalry it's different. I also have my wash brush, but that doesn't really count. That's just an old brush that you should have when you're doing any washes. But yeah, two main brushes when I'm actually doing detailed work on a model, and that's all you really need to do anything, especially a model that's this kind of size. So now we're moving on to the final highlight, and you can kind of see how I've kind of created these ridges in the cloth that aren't necessarily there, just from the fact that I've done these stippled highlights. Now what I'm kind of doing now is following these lines, creating those stipples even more, and being reserved with this bright colour. You don't want to go too over the top with it, because it'll make the highlights kind of look quite unrealistic. So just be careful with this. Follow the most the most sharp edges, the things that would hit the light first, and it's nice and really quick. So again, I think the colour is okay for these trousers. I don't think it was the right colour for the thing, but it came out okay. I'm not going to start changing it. I can look back at it and go, okay, maybe I should have chosen a different colour, but the whole model came out really well. So as a whole, it works nice. It's just, I think that the trousers personally didn't work insanely well for me, and that's them done anyway. So now we're moving on to the leather. Now this is obviously the leather on the top of the cloak, and above the strappings on his boots, like the fur on his feet and things like that. So again, starting off with this base colour, just to kind of redefine the colour. Now you can kind of see the colour that the leather is on the top of his cloak now, and as I said before, you can kind of get really nice colours with the deep brown leather from Wargames Foundry after you've washed it with Agrax Earthshade, and you'll see relatively soon how nice it comes out without a lot of work. I don't know why, but the colours in the bottles, they don't look like they work together insanely well, but actually when you get them on the model, they work really well. Now when I'm doing my basing, you'll notice that the base is already painted here, and it's actually the same colour as deep brown leather that I'm using on the leather right now. So you might think, well, why have you used the same colour for the base and the same colour for the actual leather? But actually it looks, you wouldn't even realise it unless I told you. yeah, it just shows that you can kind of get different colours depending on which techniques you use, just by you know, just because of an Agrax Earthshade creates such a nice difference. So yeah, you can kind of see me following these lines now. All of this leather on his back is not one solid part; it's a few different parts stitched together. So I'm following the lines, leaving those kind of darker gaps where the certain parts are sewn together. Try to be careful of this. Use a fine detail brush if you need to. If you are using a larger brush, then just put a little bit less paint on than you normally would, just to give you that little bit more control. And work your way around it, just to kind of start adding in those areas of interest on the leather. Now, there's loads of different ways leather can look, so obviously this is all up to you, the way you want it to look, but I like to leave quite a lot of dark areas and kind of create scratches and things like that, just to kind of create a kind of worn leather look. Now, I've done this kind of same technique on my Clegane Butcher, which is from the attachments box. So I've already kind of got the recipe for it. I use the same kind of technique when I'm doing any kind of battered, worn leather. I've done it on my mountain from the Kickstarter. It's the same kind of thing. Once you get start refining a certain technique on a model, it only gets easier and easier for you to kind of get better at, because you've practiced it way longer. So in relation to this, you could add a bit of bone colour in just to make it a bit bright if you want to, or if you wanted to go take it the other way, you could just add a bit of black in to take it darker in areas. So yeah, you can add a few blotches of watered down Nuln Oil, like black wash and things like that, to show that certain parts are even dirtier than others. There's loads of different things you can do, but this is a nice quick way to do it. I'm really happy with how this leather came out, and again, this deep brown leather from Morgan's Foundry is one of my favourite colours to use from their range, and I would definitely recommend using it. There's loads of different things you can use it for, leather, even basing. There's loads of different things you can use it for, so I 100% recommend this colour. So yeah, you can kind of see how I'm kind of creating these scratches now. Again, focusing on the edges and things like that, but there's all these kind of pits and stuff like that on the leather as well. So kind of defining them by highlighting them up as well just adds a bit more interest to the surface. Again, take your time with it if you need to. Kind of look at it in different lighting as well to see where natural highlighting hits the model, so you can kind of follow that if you need to, or if you're struggling on certain parts. It makes it a little easier if you have kind of a light source or two light sources, one on either side of the model, just to kind of make it easier for you to see exactly how the model would look under natural light. Yeah, I'm redefining those lines where the two leather parts meet. This is one of my favourite parts of doing this model, actually. Yeah, it's sculpted really nice, and it's nice to see a bit of leather on top rather than the fur that you always see everywhere. And that's the first highlight colour done, and it's looking really nice now. And we move to this much brighter colour now, and like I said before, this colour doesn't look like it actually should mix together with the two initial colours, but actually it works really well. Again, I'm doing the highlight on the bottoms of the feet, the fur on the feet, sorry. And again, I'm painting it differently to how I do the leather on the top of the cloak, so it does look different. It is the same colour, but it does look slightly different. So again, it saved me time, and it is different. You won't even really notice it that much, so that's another reason why you can use two of the same colour on a model on certain aspects, because sometimes you don't even notice it, but it keeps the model toned down with not insanely making it insanely colourful when it shouldn't actually look like that. So again, I'm kind of showing these, redefining these scratches, going around the edge. Now, the edging is, edging the edge highlight in the leather is very important, because it defines that edge is really worn, and the light is hitting it more than the other part. So edge highlighting is very important. If you don't know what that is, there's loads and loads of videos on YouTube about it, but the general gist of it is kind of using a very bright colour and then focusing only on the edges, just to kind of show that is highlighted to the maximum level. And what it does, it just kind of defines everything else around it. Now, there's loads of different ways to do it, but generally what you do is you use the side of your brush kind of like midway, or a third of the way down or 2/3 of the way down, depending on what you're doing, and kind of just drag that your brush across that surface to create that edge highlight. Now, that's the easy way to do it. You can do an edge highlight by using the tip of your brush, but obviously trying to paint a line with the tip of your brush isn't always easy. So you kind of see me do, that's the edge highlight there. It might be easier for me just to do that with the side of my brush, but that was easy enough. So that's the leather done. Now again, we're moving on to the leather the same recipe that I have for all of my 95% of all of my models. Now what I'm doing in this one, you may notice, is that I'm actually not using the beige color to redefine the leather again. Now the reason for this is I want to show that this leather is battered, beaten and dirty. So using only two colors to redefine the kind of edges of the edges of it, just kind of redefine the fact that this is a worn leather. This has seen better days, so it makes a nice bright highlight and simulates the fact that this leather is this leather's finished. It needs to get a new belt and stuff. So I use the same same highlighting on the bag and things like that. Again, you can use a different color for that if you want to, but I didn't see any reason to paint that a different color, and that's the first highlight done, nice and quick. And again, the final color. All of these colors are generally 3, A, B, and C. So this when I use like this color, like peaty brown C, it's always the last color of the process, unless I want to do any mixes or things like that. So yeah, again, I'm only focusing on these most sharp edges. I'm not going super crazy with this. I think this takes me 10-15 seconds to finish this highlight, but it is very important because it adds just another level of detail to the model. So if you don't normally go up to this bright, this level of highlighting, just try it in certain aspects of the model. You don't have to do it on all of them, but try it on certain aspects, because it will take your model just to that next level that you may be trying to get to. After the leather belt's done, we move on to the bandages, or the strapping around his arm, the strapping around his legs and things like that. So this part you want to start to be careful with. The reason why is because the detailing on these areas is very fine, so it takes a bit of time to be very neat with it. And also notice that I've kind of switched now to this much more fine detail brush. Now I'm relatively confident with painting fine detail with a larger brush. So if I switch down to a smaller brush and you don't feel confident, I would definitely switch down to a smaller size brush, because you need to have a level of control when you're doing these parts. Now, what I'm kind of doing to start off with is painting the edges of these bandages first. Now, the reason why I do that is, the first reason is I kind of see exactly what I'm trying to emulate with the surface that I'm painting, and two, after I do the edges, I can kind of see whether the middle part needs to be highlighted up. Now, sometimes in certain aspects, like on the belt, I paint the edges first, and generally 9 times out of 10 the middle part doesn't need to be highlighted because it's simulating highlighting and shading. With this bandage, it kind of has a crease down the middle, so I kind of paint that and leave as much of the darker colour between the edges and the middle part, just to show that this kind of bandage is folded. Now, as I said before, if you painted this with a large brush, you probably won't be able to get enough control to leave kind of darker areas in the middle. So use that more detailed brush, put a little bit of paint in your brush, and be careful when you're doing it, just to give you that more control. And you can kind of see how it works really well. Now, what I kind of did at the top of that bandage, that wrapping, is kind of feather out a bit of colour from the top to the bottom, just to show that light's hitting the top area. Now, I do that because I know I'm going to be highlighting up at a later stage to a brighter level. So what I can start to do is start to create those more natural blends and create less of a stark highlight, so that it looks more realistic, You'll kind of see it at a later stage if you don't understand what I'm trying to say now. But doing that feathering at the top works really, really well so that it doesn't look like it's an insanely dirty bandage. Again, besides that, I'm doing the same colour on the strapping on the legs. Be careful with this. Not all of the strappings on the legs are kind of straight, so some of them kind of overlap over one another, things like that. So try to follow it as best as possible. If you do kind of mess up and go over the gap between the bandage, then just do another Agrex Surface wash over it, and it should kind of correct itself. So yeah, makes it nice and easy just to kind of create that shading if you do make a mistake again. Again, turn the model, make sure it's all done, and move on to the next stage now. Now these colours are very interesting because when I first tried these on an older model, I didn't really think that they worked well together. But I stuck with it, I worked all the way through, and it does really work at the end. But this colour looks kind of more greeny than, you know, maybe the colour should look as a highlight. But it works really well. So just, again, take your time with it, and we're being a lot more specific with the highlights now. Focusing on the edges, again, leaving those darkest colours, but you know, where the Agrex surface settle, leaving that in the recesses, and also leaving some of that initial colour underneath, just to show that there's a natural smooth blend. You know, the blending that I'm doing on these on this guy, sorry, is not insanely, you know, to an insane level. If I wanted to create smoother blends, I would do a lot more feathering, a lot more wet blending. You know, there's loads of different techniques to make smoother blends, but I'm just trying to simulate, you know, a nice blend and nice highlights. You can see where I kind of done, again, I've done the edges first, and then I've done that line down the middle to show the highlighting, and you can see how that feathering works now, because it leaves that initial highlight colour at the top, which makes it look more smooth of a transition, and also look like it's actually that surface that I'm trying to show. So that's why I did that, and you can kind of see now how it works. Now we've still got one more highlight to do after this, so once I pick it out even more, it'll work even better. So you can, you know, that's the thought process that I went earlier on. You can kind of see how it's kind of working now. Again, I'm doing it on these leg strappings. I'm not going too crazy with this because, one, you don't really look at the legs when you're doing it. You know, it's not something that you pick up and look at straight away. But, you know, there's also shading in these areas, so I don't go crazy with it. I do a little bit here and there, the parts that I can be bothered to do, really. And then I move on to the final colour. Now again, this is when it comes to these colours, it's always a lot brighter than all the colours beforehand, so you want to be very careful when you're doing these highlights. Just picking out those most prominent lines. Again, it's very, very important to be careful with how much paint you have on when you're doing these highlights, just to give you as much control as possible. Now, you see a lot of things about you know, how the consistency of your paint should be, what brush you should use, you know, what's the best brush you can use to paint a model. But actually, one of the most important things that doesn't always get talked about is how much paint do you put on your brush. Notice how much paint I have on my brush. It's very, very important only to put a little bit on, dependent on what you're painting at that point in time. You use a bigger brush to have more paint to create, you know, when you're doing a base coat, but when you're doing a detailed area, you only want to put a little bit on a tip, just to give you that control. And it's better to keep on going back to the paint pot slash you know, wet palette or whatever you're using. It's better to keep on going backwards and forwards from that to the model than trying to put too much on your brush at once and then having no control at all, because you'll have to spend even more time fixing problems that you made. So once that's done, you can kind of see how those highlights work really nicely. And we're moving on to the final, you know, more or less the final parts of this model now. Besides the cloak, besides the cloak and the hair, sorry, we've got these chains to do now. The metal recipe that I use for all of these models in this game so far, you know, the whole Lannister army and a few odd characters from different factions here and there, I've used more or less the same armor recipe. It's the metal, it's the wash, and the highlight. Now, you don't have to go crazy with metal or true metallic metals because they have a natural highlight and shade. So Using this one colour just kind of creates that nice transition of colour without me having to go over the top of it. Again, you want to be careful because these are links to a chain, so you want to leave kind of black parts where the chain obviously links to another chain, and also, you know, don't forget to do that belt buckle, being careful of the leather. And like I said before, make sure you do the chain all the way down over his tunic, because I forgot that on mine, so don't forget that. And that's a nice, quick, easy way to do the metal. So once that's done, now we move on to the cloth. Now I'm leaving the hair till last, because sometimes what I do is I touch the top of the model just out of habit, and I've said about this before in one of my other videos. I have a contact point when I'm painting models, and generally that's the top part, or, you know, if a sword's raised above his head, I'll touch the sword, but generally it's the hair or the head or the helmet. So I leave that till last, just because I don't want to scratch the surface, because there's been plenty of times when I first started painting that I touched the hair after painting it and it messes up the surface. So I got out of the habit of doing that early and started leaving it until last, so that I didn't ever touch it. So the cloak's the final part before the hair now, and you can kind of see what I'm doing is redefining this initial base colour with the base coat that we used to start. Now, because I didn't do an insanely heavy wash of Agrax Earthshade on this cloak, you can kind of see how the colour's already automatically blending in with the colour underneath. So we've already got a nice smooth transition. So for one, that's really nice and easy. And two, because the colour's not a stark difference between, the colours after this aren't a stark difference between the base coat, the transition of colour will be very, very nice and smooth. So it's kind of effortless to create this. You have to be careful to create those nice smooth blends still, because if your paint's too thick or anything like that, it will make it hard for you to get a smooth blend. But just by using the base coat after the wash, the wash being not too heavy, makes it a lot easier for me to create this smooth transition straight away. Again, you can see what I was talking about before with the cloak being really nicely sculpted. You know, you can see exactly where the folds are, what parts need to be highlighted, and everything like that. So it's a really, really nice to paint this model. It does paint itself at this point in time. The brush is kind of doing the work for me. But yeah, you can kind of see how quickly those smooth transitions look all together. Again, it's not too bright, it's not too harsh of a highlight, because obviously this is the base colour that we used to start off with. But you can kind of see now that because we've redefined that initial colour, we can see where the highlights are going to be going at a later stage in time, which makes it a lot easier for you to paint, which is why I say that this part is important to do after you do a wash. Again, I'm turning it around to make sure I get all of these parts, trying to go all the way up to the top or as close as possible to this leather, so that it doesn't look like there were certain parts under there that just looked a bit too dark, so I kind of took my paintbrush a little bit higher up just to kind of make it look more realistic. And after that, that's the first colour done for that. So once the colour's dry for that, now what I would say is make sure these colours are properly dry before moving on to the next stage, because the colours aren't insanely different. The highlight colour isn't insanely different to the stage beforehand. So make sure the previous colour is properly dry, and then start to come in with these highlights. Now, because we've done the base colour first, like I said, we can see exactly where we want these highlights to go, because it's the creases are there themselves. So we're going to be following them all the way around. Again, we're going to be leaving some of that base colour underneath so that it creates a nice smooth transition, leaving that darker colour in the recesses, and this smooth transition of colour starts to kind of show now. You can kind of see there. Now, if I start to do a part that looks a little bit too harsh, what I kind of do is just feather it out into the area around it. So it's important to make sure that you don't have too much paint on your brush at this point in time when you're doing these first initial highlights, because you want to be able to feather it out if you do make a bit of a mistake with how much paint you put on. So you can kind of see me doing it there quite a lot. I've done it twice now. So it's very, very important to understand how to do this technique. Feathering I've talked about a lot in my videos. The general gist of it is kind of putting on an initial bit of colour and then making sure your brush is dry and relatively clean, and then kind of quickly moving that initial bit of colour over the darker surface to kind of create a smooth transition of colour. That's a general idea of it. There's a bit more of it, a bit more to the technique than that, but that's a general idea of it. I do go in depth in some of my other videos, so if you want to check them out, please do. But yeah, you can kind of see what I mean when I'm talking about feathering. You can kind of see, if you take notice of what I'm doing at certain points, you notice that I kind of put on a bit of colour and then quickly drag the paint into other parts just to kind of create a smoother transition than normally you would see if I just done one line. So just please take notice of that if you want to kind of understand what I actually mean by it. It's one thing me telling you how to do it and a different thing actually me showing you. But whilst I'm talking about it in this video, I'm actually showing you how to do it. Obviously I do the commentary after I've painted the model, so it's easy for me to actually look at, I'm looking at this part now and commenting about the part specifically at this point in time. So when I talk about a technique, generally I'm doing it at that point in time. Now we're moving on to the final highlight colour of this cloak. Now, like I said before, all final highlights are generally very bright, so you want to be careful when you're doing this. Thankfully, the highlight isn't too harsh on this blue, but again, still be careful with it. We're only focusing on the edges, on those folds that we've already created. What you generally want to do when you're doing a cloak is focus these highlights mainly on the top parts. Now, this isn't the hard and fast rule. This is the only way you need to do cloaks. Don't ever do it a different way. But generally, the rule is, and I would say this specifically for new painters, focus these new highlights from the top to kind of show that the cloak is dirtier at the bottom naturally, without you having to do any kind of weathering techniques or anything like that. It's just kind of natural. Obviously, light will hit the top of someone naturally more than the bottom. So making highlights towards the top of something and having it darker at the bottom just looks more natural. This isn't always the case, like I say, but more times than not, it's better to do it this way just to kind of create that natural highlighting. You kind of see how quick this stage is. Obviously, I'm focusing all the way around these edges to the top parts of these folds and things like that. If I need to, I kind of feather out this colour. I'm trying not to go too crazy with putting this bright colour on the bottom parts of the cloak, but if I need to, if the crease goes all the way down to the bottom and it's a sharp edge, I follow it all the way around, down to the bottom. But you can kind of see how this kind of cloak looks really, really nice and smooth now. There's always more ways to make it even smoother than what I've done, but for the time spent on it and only using a few colours, it still looks nice and smooth in my eyes. So I'm very, very happy with how it looks. Again, notice how I'm turning the model, just making sure that I get all these little parts, and you can kind of see me picking out a few of these little kind of damaged parts of the cloak. So don't forget them. It's nice to kind of add these little extra specks of detail just to kind of bring out certain parts of it. So what I'm doing now is there's a few little stitches here and there on the model. So on the the leather and things like that, and also on the trousers that he's wearing, there's a few there that I noticed when I'm painting. So I'm picking out these parts now because the last part to actually do is the hair. So like I said before, I always leave the hair till last. So I'm picking out these little details now. Now you can do these little details at any point in time if you want, but I just find it easier for me to do it now. But again, because these parts are very fine and we've already painted everything but the hair, you want to be very, very careful not to kind of get this paint on any of the parts that we've already done. So notice how I've got my most fine detail brush, and look how much paint I've got on the tip. I've not got much at all, and look how slow I'm kind of doing these brush strokes. So what I generally tend to do when I'm doing these parts is slowly move the brush near the surface, not on the surface straight away, near the surface, and then slowly lower my brush towards the surface that I'm painting, just to have even more control than what you normally would. Now, I do kind of get a bit of a dodgy angle in some parts of this, of this tutorial here, but I kind of notice it, so kind of correct it. But you kind of get a general idea of what I'm kind of trying to simulate with the kind of brush strokes that I'm creating, and the colour that I'm using. Yeah, these are the only parts on the model that have these stitches, so yeah, you don't have to really look at it anywhere else. And we're moving on to the final colour of these stitches now. Now, if I left it a flat colour, it just wouldn't look right. You can leave it like that if you want to, but I just think because I've highlighted everything else up, just adding a little bit of spot of colour onto these stitches just makes them look a bit more, just brings out a bit more detail. So it makes it a lot easier to do it now because we've already picked out the colour on them. So just adding a bit of spot of colour should be a lot easier than doing the initial base coat. So you can see where I kind of got a little bit more paint on the tip of my brush there, just because I'm confident with how much control I have. But if you're not confident, be more careful, put a little bit less paint on, and that's the stitches, quick and easy. So we're moving on to the hair now. Now, I've already painted Jaime Lannister, I've painted Cersei Lannister, and I've used the same technique for both of them for their hair. Now, as mentioned before, this is a Jaime that's dirty. So what I decided to do is do a dirty colour to start off with his hair. Now, the general, the end effect, his hair is still blonde. I can't take away from the fact that his hair is blonde. But what I can kind of start to simulate is the fact that he is dirtier than he normally would be. Now, he's still a valuable prisoner. He wouldn't be not cared for, but he would be dirtier. So what I do is I kind of come in with this dirtier kind of blonde colour, this kind of buff leather colour. Now, obviously, buff leather is kind of this kind of more goldy brown sort of. So it works well to kind of create a dirty blonde colour. Now, instead of doing this, what you could do is kind of do a like a brown wash over the hair after you've painted it. Obviously, I'm sure most of you probably have your own techniques for doing blonde hair. So if you kind of follow the way that I've been doing the blonde hair, and want to create a dirtier blonde, then using this colour to start off with just makes it a lot easier for you to kind of show that his hair is darker than what normally would be. Now, I've showed you the end result at the start of the video, so you can kind of see exactly how it kind of turns out, and it's not insanely different to Jaime that I painted, the young lion Jaime model from the starter set. It's not insanely different, but it's still different enough to kind of show that he is dirtier than he normally would be. So because it's the final part of the model, I'm using this fine detail brush. I'm being very, very, very careful around the face and everything else that I've already painted. Now, because I black lined it earlier on, it's easier for me to see exactly where the hairline starts and stops in relation to the face and the skin tone. So it's important to obviously have done that black lining earlier on. If you didn't, then what it would kind of do is create a kind of transition between skin and hair straight away, which doesn't always look right. Sometimes it does, not always. So just be careful of that when you're painting. But yeah, I kind of decided to do that, and you kind of make it a lot easier for you to see. Now, you might have noticed what I've done is I've kind of done the trim, I've done the edge of the hair all the way around, and then what I do is paint in the top. Now, this is the easiest way that I found to do hair, because what I can do now is kind of be a bit slapdash with it and just kind of slap the paint on in between those lines that I've already created. Now, if you don't do it this way, then be more careful. But it's a nice, quick way, quick little technique for you to kind of paint hair a lot quicker, because if you're neater at the start and fill in all of the lines, then all you have to do is paint between the lines, and you learn how to do that when you're a lot very, very young. So painting between the lines is a lot easier than being neat all the way around the model. Again, try to get a solid colour. This is obviously the base coat of his hair. It's not different to the blonde that I used earlier on for the other Jaime Lannister, but it's dark enough to show a difference. So once the base coat's done, what I start to do now is use the same recipe for the hair that I normally would. Now, this Boneyard 8 is not much different to the colour that I used as a base coat, the buff leather, but it's slightly different. So it creates that kind of that kind of area of interest, that darker tone than what he normally would have. So this is kind of redefining the detail on his face and things like that. The hair on his his beard, sorry, and the hair on his head kind of has good enough sculpting for you to see each individual strand of hair. So you can kind of follow that, but at this point in time, what I'm trying to do is kind of show that certain areas are more blocky than others, and I'm trying to leave this initial base colour in the darker areas. So that's the kind of process that I'm going through at this point in time, and I'm waiting to do more stark highlights when I get to the brighter colours later on. I wouldn't dry brush this colour on because you don't have much control at all. You can do if you want to, but I think it's too risky to do a dry brush of hair at this point in time, because what you're more than likely to do is get speckles of paint on things that you've already painted, and dry brushes are normally very scraggly, so you probably don't have much control at all, so you will probably get it on something that's already been painted. So just use a more detailed brush, try to pick out the hairs individually, or more or less individually. I'm not doing individual strands of hair on this guy, but I'm trying to kind of simulate that there are individual strands of hair, and you can kind of see what I'm kind of doing to show that. So it shows up a lot more when I'm doing the brighter colours later on, with this one and obviously the final highlight. But you don't have to do this if you don't want to. It's just to kind of show that there are individual strands of hair. Now, because I've been careful with the highlighting at earlier stages on, keeping a kind of same level of painting, doing a base colour, a highlight and a edge highlight, keeping the same kind of process all the way through the model, depending on whether it's a belt or hair or legs or armour. It's better to have that kind of same process all the way through the model to kind of keep it at the same level. Now, if I just done, painted this hair a base colour and then dry brushed it, it would look so different to the rest of the model that it would just look out of place. So being careful, taking my time with this hair, keeps the model all in the same kind of style. Now, obviously that's not the case for all models. Sometimes it's good to paint a hair using a dry brush. Some of you may find it very, very quick to do that. That's fine, but I wouldn't dry brush the hair at this point in time. If you wanted to, you could paint the hair first and do a dry brush, because at that point in time you're never going to get it on anything that's already been painted, because it's the first thing you've done. But you have to be careful after you do that, because you could touch the hair during the painting process and then mess up the surface anyway, so you have to go over it after anyway. So these are just kind of a few things to think about when you're doing it. Here you can obviously see I'm kind of painting these individual lines, leaving the kind of darker areas where the shading would naturally be in the hair. But again, you can see I'm not doing each individual strand of hair. It will take me all day to do that, but I'm kind of simulating there being individual strands of hair by just doing loads of lines simultaneously next to each other across the surface. Some parts of the model obviously show more detail than other parts in relation to this hair, so it's easy to follow them and kind of fill in the gaps in between. But if the surface of the hair is obviously flat, then I think doing this technique that I'm doing by painting individual lines makes it a lot more realistic, because if you dry brush that, it would just look flat. So this is why I think dry brushing plastics isn't always good, because sometimes detail can be soft. Again, keep on redefining these lines. I don't want to have too much of this dark colour, because he is still blonde, but I still want to show that he is has darker hair than you normally would. Again, dragging that over, trying to mix it all in, and that's that second colour done. Now we're moving on to this final colour now, and I'm being very, very careful with this. And I was careful with it when I done the Jaime and Cersei Lannister anyway, but there are really nice highlighting spots for this colour at this point in time. So I'm just very reserved with how much I actually do on this. And obviously you can kind of see that he is blonde. It's a relatively dirty blonde in comparison to what I did beforehand. So I'm happy with how it looked. If you picked up the model and I said to you, "Oh, that's a dirty blonde," you wouldn't. That's not a dirty blonde color. But in comparison to how bright the boneyard would have been without that buff leather base coat to start off with, it is a dirty blonde in comparison. You can kind of see I'm kind of focusing off these lighter colours towards the top, and again I'm feathering out the colour if it's too bright in certain areas, just to kind of blend in, create a smoother transition. And again, creating those lines to simulate individual strands of hair, or more or less what are individual strands of hair. Focusing on these the folds in the hair as well. The hair sculpted very, very nice in this model, so creating these highlights on the folds are very, very nice and quick. We're moving on to the final parts of the hair now, so again, just redefine those lines if you need to. Make sure that nothing looks too out of place, and feather out if you need to. Just do a quick once over, and that's the hair done. Now, that would normally be a model done, and I'm happy with that. But what I decided, as I was mentioning about the weathering on the cloak earlier on, I decided to kind of do a quick way of doing a nice weathering technique on cloth by using just a wash. Now, there's loads of different weathering powders, there's loads of different techniques you can do for weathering, but creating weathering with a drop, weathering with a wash, is a lot easier, and it's more likely that you can do this because most people have washes at home. Now, what I'm using as a wash for this is Agrax Earthshade. Like I said before, Agrax Earthshade is liquid gold. It's so versatile, you can use it for so many things. So what I'm doing is I'm using it, and I'm using a very, very scraggly brush. You can see that it's detailed, so I can kind of control where I want the paint to go, but it's still a scraggly old brush that I wouldn't use for anything else besides basing and washes. So you can notice how I'm kind of creating these stippled effects in certain areas of the cloak. Now, you can keep on building this up here and there just to kind of create these areas of dark shadow, just to kind of show that there's mud on the bottom of these things, and you can keep on building this up more and more and more as you like. It's important though to make sure that nothing looks like it's a blob. So kind of smooth out these areas. The stipple technique makes it so it's irregular, but make sure that there's no blobs so that it's a nice look to the actual weathering. And this is the model done. I think it turned out really, really well, and as I turn it you can see how I've kind of built up this wash layer just so that the cloak looks more dirty than it normally would, and it's quick and easy. I did add a bit of Nuln Oil in certain areas just to add a bit of a darker tone in some places, so you can do that if you like. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and don't forget to paint and play.